Hello everyone, welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Today we're going to talk about the most disturbing aspect of the Affordable Care Act rollout in recent weeks. And also later on in the program we'll show you a nice feature about the Canadian Brass and their most recent performance here in Armstrong Auditorium.
The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Today I want to update the American people on our efforts to implement and improve the Affordable Care Act. Already, people who have plans that predate the Affordable Care Act can keep those plans if they haven't changed. That was already in the law. That's what's called a grandfather clause that was included in the law. Today we're going to extend that principle both to people whose plans have changed since the law took effect and to people who bought plans since the law took effect.
This is something we ought to be really, really troubled about, don't you think?
You are exactly right. It is one of the most profoundly troubling aspects of the Obama administration is the degree to which this is a lawless administration. We've never seen a president who picks and chooses the way this president does. It is the antithesis of rule of law. It is rule by arbitrary whim and discretion. And as you know well, that is profoundly dangerous.
I wonder if he has the legal authority to do this, since this was a congressional bill that set this up.
This is entirely lawless, and the fact that nobody is talking about this, the executive executes the laws. As you say, this is another example of Obama rewriting a law unilaterally, and nobody is complaining.
The truth is, we can no longer wait for Congress to do its job. The middle-class families who have been struggling for years are tired of waiting. They need help now. So where Congress won't act, I will.
Understand, President Obama cannot legally do what he proposed to do yesterday, and the media let him get away with claiming. He can't fix part of a law that he doesn't like by fiat. Our president is not a king. He doesn't get to make decrees.
If Congress won't act soon to protect future generations, I will. I will direct my cabinet to come up with executive actions we can take now and in the future to reduce pollution, prepare our communities for the consequences of climate change, and speed the transition to more sustainable sources of energy. Effective immediately, the Department of Homeland Security is taking steps to lift the shadow of deportation from these young people. It is the right thing to do.
Last week, President Obama attempted to fix the problem with the Affordable Care Act by saying that he's going to allow people that have lost their insurance plans one more year to stay on their old plans, their previous plans. And you've probably heard by now, no doubt, about the millions of Americans across the United States that were told that they could keep their plans and keep their doctors and so on, repeatedly promised from President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and the others, that they could keep everything just like it was. And of course, as you know, now, with many reports on both sides of the left and right, there's a reason they had to make those promises back in 2010, leading up to the passage of that bill. They had to make those promises in order to get the bill to go through. As Byron York noted last Thursday, he said if they had declared openly that millions of Americans would lose their current coverage and face higher premiums and deductibles, if Obama and Democratic leaders had said that, they would not have been able to maintain party unity in support of the bill, and the Affordable Care Act would never have passed. So they said whatever was necessary in order to ram the law through, even if it meant lying and deceiving people along the way. And now, of course, the reality is setting in, and many Americans have awakened to the fact that a lot has changed and that they have been forced off of old plans and are now having to buy more expensive ones with higher deductibles and so on. But the problem with fixing this, as the president tried to do last Thursday, is that he really has no constitutional authority to decide what parts of a law that has legally been passed through Congress, even if it was completely one-sided, but still he has no constitutional authority to decide what parts of the law are applied and what parts are not, and that's essentially what he did last week. Article 2 of the Constitution says that the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. So the president of the United States is constitutionally bound to execute the laws of the land, these laws that pass through the House and the Senate. He obviously doesn't have the authority to make new laws, or as I said a moment ago, to decide what parts of the law are applicable to this group or to that group. And yet, if you look at the past several years, not just with the Affordable Care Act, but really the last several years of this administration, we've seen a lot of that happening. Now, with respect to the ACA itself, after its passage in 2010, as we got closer to this year, the deadline year, you had a lot of people in big business, friends of the administration, who were complaining that this was going to make it difficult for their companies to run. And so what did the president, the White House do? Well, they gave big businesses an exemption, and then others complained. Congress complained about how it was going to make it difficult for the staff of these congressmen. And so to make it easier on Congress and all of their workers there at the Capitol, they were given an exemption. And then now more recently, you had millions of Americans complaining that their premiums were higher, that their deductibles were higher. And you had a former president last week, Bill Clinton, even say that the president should do something, even if he needed to change the law, Mr. Clinton said, in order to ensure that those people could keep their insurance policies as they were promised. And so then we heard last week, again, the solution put forward by the president. It actually wasn't to change the law. It was to make a presidential decree saying that those people that lost their insurance could keep it, at least for another year, which just takes us through to the next election cycle next year. So it's turned into a pretty big mess, but the most disturbing aspect of this, as I said at the top, is not so much whether it's good law or bad law or the fact that Americans were deceived along the way. The most disturbing aspect of this, as has been plainly revealed, is the fact that you see a lot of rule now in this nation by decree, by executive order. Senator Ted Cruz recently said that these actions, last Thursday in particular, is the very antithesis of rule of law. It is rule by arbitrary whim and discretion. He's on the far right, I guess many would say. And yet you look at someone on the far left, Howard Dean, who also wondered aloud on television if the president even had the authority to make this fix last Thursday. Both sides of the political equation. In that Ted Cruz statement, by the way, he said that the United States is on a profoundly dangerous course. This course that we're on with rule by presidential decree. And yet, how many people are sitting up and taking note, even in the debate over the Health Care Act? How many people are sitting up and taking note of what's happening, of how we're being ruled increasingly, as I said in a previous program, by a smaller and smaller group of technocrats who think that they know better than the law, who think that they know better than the people. Most people don't care. Most people aren't listening. Most people don't take notice. This is what Charles Krauthammer, the columnist, said last week. He said that this presidential fix on Thursday of last week, that it's another example of Obama rewriting a law unilaterally, and nobody is complaining. Nobody's complaining about it. Nobody says a thing. There's just another executive order or another decree, and then life moves on. Let's look at Romans 4. Just take a look at a couple of verses in the book of Romans today. And then in the book of Daniel we'll go to a little bit later. As you get your Bible, if you'd like to follow along, let me just quote to you from one other article. This is Victor Davis Hanson from November 14th. He said, aside from the question of whether it is legal or right for the president to decide arbitrarily which elements of legislation to faithfully execute, it is also a sort of new way of ad hoc governing. The president grandly introduces a new piece of unworkable legislation, does not know or care much about the consequences of implementing it, demagogues the bill, demonizes the opposition, gets it passed, uses the passage for political purposes, and then waits to see what happens in the real world. It's a pretty good summary of the last few years of what's happened since that bill was passed in 2010 and all of the grand promises, the demonizing of people like Ted Cruz and others who were sounding the alarm actually. And now the facts have set in. Now reality is upon us. Now the law is in action, or at least with certain groups of people. He goes on and says, when more than 50% of the country is outraged, this is continuing with his summary of the situation, he, speaking of the president, scraps what he finds politically useful to scrap. Apparently, Obama believes that after such trial and error, he will work the bugs out of the ACA and end up with what he can call a success. Too bad for those who lose coverage or pay more in the meantime, and for the legalists who worry that what he's doing is against the law. Too bad for those people. He says, all this is right out of the radical Athenian assembly, which on any given day could do whatever its majority wished, and then the next undo whatever it wished. He says, but such governance is not what the framers had in mind when they established the checks and balances of a Republican tripartite government and entrusted the president with faithfully executing all the laws passed by Congress and signed by him. It's not what the framers had in mind at all. As you can read there in Article 2 of the Constitution, the president's there to execute the law, to make sure that it's enforced. Romans 4 here in verse 15, it says, because the law works wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. Now the subject matter here has to do with God's spiritual law, the great 10 Commandments, but there's an important principle here that we can look at and that I think is important to examine with respect to what's happening in the United States. The United States increasingly, I mean, whether you look in the field of academia or among scholarship, constitutional scholars, or politicians, in particular now in Washington, the technocrats group, there's an increasing number of them that really look upon the law, particularly constitutional law, as part of the problem, or the main problem, or what we need to get around, or bypass, or circumvent, en route to putting out there what they know is good for you. There's a growing number of them. Get rid of that old law, get rid of the rule of law, and let us carry on with our agenda, our progressive agenda. We talk a lot about that, by the way, and I'll talk about this more toward the end, but there's an entire chapter, Chapter 3 of America Under Attack, which looks back at these last few years where we've just seen so many more executive orders, so many more attempts, not just from the White House, but the Justice Department or wherever, attempts to get around the law, or cases like with immigration where the law simply isn't applied or enforced. There's quite a few examples, but getting back to this big, expanding group of scholars that want to do away with the law, they think that, well, if we could just get away from the rule of law, then we can solve so many of the problems. But as Paul brings out here, if you don't have any law, then there's no sin, there's no transgression. You have nothing to really tell us what's right from wrong. And what you're left with then in that scenario is where everyone's running around doing what seems right in his own eyes, like it says at in the book of Judges, there at the end of that story. I mean, it just resulted in anarchy in ancient Israel, and ultimately it led to their demise and eventual captivity. Sin brought the nation down, trying to get around God's law, trying to get around the rule of law. It led to anarchy. If you don't have the rule of law, that's what inevitably happens. Look back at chapter 3. This is Romans 3. Just back up a chapter. Verse 10, it says, "As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one." So he says in this same chapter down in verse 23 that all have sinned. All have sinned. I mean, the Bible, it gives us a pretty clear picture of what God says about the nature of man. There's a lot in our minds and thoughts that we need to change and repent of on this journey to become like God, to become God, part of God's family. God tells us all have sinned and fallen short. So what do we do about that? How do we know where sin is? How do we know what to do about sin? Well, we wouldn't know anything were it not for God's law. Verse 11, it says, "There is none that understands, there is none that seeks after God. They are all gone out of the way," it says. "They are together become unprofitable. There is none that does good, no, not one." None, Paul said. Now, it's passages like this. I mean, this is why America's founders believed when they started out with this American experiment. This is why they firmly believed that this nation could only survive and prosper if it was founded upon religion and morality. So many of them said that. We point that out over and again with many quotes from our history in Character in Crisis, another booklet that we have and we'll give to you free of charge. John Adams, America's second president, said, "It's religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand." That's the foundation, religion and morality, this Judeo-Christian ethic on which our Constitution was constructed and raised up. Now, you don't see that kind of leadership today in Washington. Far, far from it. The New York Times, back in April of 2012, wrote, "Increasingly in recent months, the administration has been seeking ways to act without Congress." That's the New York Times, a pretty big friend of the administration, saying that increasingly the administration has been looking for ways to get around Congress, to get around the branch of government that passes the laws, and to act. How many times in recent years have you heard this president say, "If Congress doesn't act, I will"? I mean, those are disturbing statements that, as Krauthammer said in that commentary, most people don't even take note of. Doesn't seem to bother people. But I can tell you, it's disturbing, and we talk about it at length in America Under Attack. You need this booklet. It was put out earlier this year, and even since it was distributed, we've seen some increasingly more disturbing events that have transpired in the United States. Verse 13 here in chapter 3, "Their throat is an open sepulchre, with their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asps is under their lips, whose mouth," it says, "is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood." See, this is where lawlessness is leading. It's leading to widespread violence in the streets, violence in our cities, anarchy, rebellion against authority. I mean, when every man's doing what seems right in his own eyes, how are you going to maintain peace and order when things start to fall apart? We're seeing the beginning stages of it now. And it's going to build and build and build right to Ezekiel 5 and prophecies like that. How can you maintain order and peace in any society if the rule of law breaks down? Let's look at Daniel, the book of Daniel in the Old Testament, Daniel chapter 8. Daniel chapter 8, as I said, we devote an entire chapter in America Under Attack to this breakdown of law in our society There's 3 chapters in this booklet, and my father talks about how when Satan is out to take anything down, an institution, a church, a nation, he's always going to attack from within. He's going to go right to the top. This 3rd chapter is an attack on law, and we've really seen that attack intensify in recent years. An attack on law. People who feel like if we just get rid of that old law, that outdated document, then wouldn't things be so much better? Daniel 8 here in verse 11, it says, yes, he magnified himself even to the prince of the host, and by him, it says, the daily sacrifice, the work was taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. And an host, it says, was given him against the daily by reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. So here, and this has to do with God's work in these latter days. We've seen a lot of that. This work that you're seeing here today, we lived through this history. We've seen how fast a church can be destroyed that gets away from truth, that gets away from the rule of law. We had to go to court just to fight to preserve God's truth in a church that just wanted to bury it, in a church that wanted to bury God's truth. And how did it all break down? How did it all get started off track that way? Well, it always gets back to transgression. Sin, in other words. Sin is the transgression of God's law. And so with respect to that history that we've seen, some of us in God's church, Satan's first objective there was to destroy the truth, to destroy God's law. That's what we bring out in this booklet. And so again, going back to what it says there in Romans and just the principle at play here with respect to America and constitutional law, what do you suppose will happen when things really begin to break down and when every man does what seems right? In America Under Attack, page 25 of this booklet, my father says, when he attacked the church, speaking of the devil, he got people in at the top who cast all the truth to the ground. He says it is logical that he would use the same tactics when attacking the nations of Israel. Of course, the latter-day nations of Israel are the United States and Britain primarily. So he's talking about the United States in particular, as you can see, the White House there on the cover of this booklet. My father says that's the most efficient way to do it. Then he can use them to wage an assault from within on the truth and the law. So it starts from the top, but really, as Daniel 8 brings out here, the people, the masses as well, have certainly played a role in this. Like Krauthammer brought out, I mean, most people don't notice, they don't care, they don't pay any attention. They couldn't care less. There's too many other things that they want to keep occupied with in entertainment or sports or whatever it is. So it's the sins of the people, certainly, that have opened the way for this sort of lawlessness. That's what we see in Washington today, a spirit of lawlessness. It's the antithesis of the rule of law, as that senator said. The exact opposite of what leaders in Washington should be upholding and reinforcing. We'll be right back.
A turning point in recent history has gone almost entirely overlooked. Since that time, an unseen cause has brought about national and world troubles in unprecedented fashion. Crises are intensifying as never before. In our generation, we are seeing radical changes to culture, family, education, religion, science, finance, politics, international relations. Everything has been affected. You cannot understand events without recognizing this unseen cause. The United States has been shaken in astonishing fashion. Have you wondered why the world's #1 superpower is declining so rapidly? Are you concerned about where the current administration is leading this country? The Bible provides penetrating insight into the invisible cause of society's decline. America is prophesied to fall before it rises again. The Bible also gives extraordinary insight into how that fall will come about. This insight puts the seriousness and urgency of current events in their true perspective. Understand what's in store for America and why. Visit thetrumpet.com and click on the Literature tab to request this free enlightening booklet, America Under Attack.
Okay, so following on what we've talked about today, make sure that you contact this organization, get on thetrumpet.com and go to the Literature tab. You can also, if you're watching the video online, you can also click on the video itself when the literature appears to get a free copy or to be able to order your booklet. And also I want to plug the Trumpet Weekly. I've said this before, it comes out every Friday. It's generally 10, 12 pages in length, and it will keep you right up to date with everything that's happening in the world. And you can pay attention to what's happening if you just keep regular with what this church is producing. So today we're going to conclude the program by featuring the Canadian Brass. They recently performed here in Armstrong Auditorium. I think it was November the 7th. So we've put together a nice 3 or 4 minute feature that will summarize the events from that evening. Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.
Donned in suits and sneakers, the world-renowned Canadian Brass performed at Armstrong Auditorium on November 7th. The program of sophisticated virtuosic brass playing, along with captivating showmanship, delighted the sellout crowd at Armstrong.
Would at this time like to perform Johann Sebastian Bach's most famous composition, which tonight will be the fugue in G minor. This is a work that has attracted the title of the Little Fugue in G minor, suggesting there is a large fugue also by Bach in G minor, which in fact there is. There is a large fugue, and it's known as the Great Fugue, translated from German, die große Fuge, meaning large, but translated as great in the sense of great, large, but also suggesting that's a great fugue, and this one isn't. Which is not the case at all. Given the length of this piece, it might be greater than the Great Fugue. So we'd like to perform this work tonight as the Great Little Fugue in G minor.
Though this was their 4th time on the Armstrong International Cultural Foundation's Performing Arts Series, this was their first time performing in Armstrong Auditorium since it opened in 2010.
It really has that nice balance of being able to hear each other and also being able to hear yourself. And I guess from what we hear from the audience, it sounds like a nice balanced sound out there too. So, I mean, what else can you ask for?
The group was able to tour the Performing Arts Center as well as meet the chairman of the Armstrong Foundation, Gerald Fleury. The 43-year-old ensemble has only one original member remaining in the quintet, but the program kept their legacy alive of impeccable art merged with side-splitting entertainment.
Okay, so we'd like to play one more piece for you, and just before we do that, I'm sure you must hear it every time you come to this concert hall. Every performer that ever steps on the stage must have the same reaction. We just love this concert hall. It's so gorgeous, and it's such a warm environment to play in. And what it really needed, the finishing touch, of course, was you. It's a great audience. Thank you for coming and sharing this night with us.